My name is Hugo, and I'm 22. I've been with Olivia for 3 years, and our relationship has been generally smooth sailing. However, one constant hurdle has been her father, Mr. Ernest. He's a retired police officer, a man of imposing stature and an air of authority that commands respect. Extremely protective of Olivia, he could be difficult at times, though I knew underneath it all he was a decent man. From the beginning, our interactions were strained. Not outright rude, but he made it clear he was always watching, scrutinizing my every move, his serious expression never wavering. Mr. Ernest was a man of few words, carefully chosen and delivered with a controlled, authoritative tone. Years on the force seemed to have shaped every facet of his personality. Despite this, I couldn't deny he was also capable of fairness and even occasional levity. His love for his family, and particularly Olivia, was evident, a palpable affection. Perhaps this love was the source of his protectiveness and what made him so hard to impress. I decided to propose to Olivia, and she accepted. To celebrate, we planned a weekend getaway to her family's mountain house. The anticipated day arrived, and we all piled into Mr. Ernest's truck. He drove, as always, with that familiar air of command. Olivia and her mother chatted animatedly in the back while I sat quietly up front, taking in the scenery and politely responding to Mr. Ernest's infrequent remarks. The drive was pleasant, a cool breeze flowing through the open windows and the scent of mountain vegetation signaling our approach. We arrived just before noon. The sun was high in the sky, illuminating the house like a picture postcard. It was a rustic, dark wood structure nestled amidst a sprawling lawn and trees that seemed to scrape the sky. We unloaded the truck, and Olivia, ever organized, quickly joined her mother to unpack and prepare lunch. I was about to offer my assistance when Mr. Ernest called me over. "Hugo, how about a walk?" he said casually, but with a tone that suggested it wasn't a request. I changed into comfortable shorts and a t-shirt, applying sunscreen as the sun felt intense. When I emerged, Mr. Ernest was waiting, wearing a cap and a small, almost imperceptible smile. We followed a dirt path to the left of the house, leading towards the distant hills. As we walked, the air felt cooler, the silence broken only by our footsteps and birdsong. I felt a little on edge, but determined to enjoy the moment. "Beautiful place, isn't it?" he remarked, not looking at me directly, as if gauging my reaction. "Very. I can see why Olivia loves it here," I replied, trying to sound at ease. He nodded and continued walking. I wasn't sure where we were going, but the atmosphere between us felt slightly less tense than usual. We walked for several minutes until the path opened to a stunning vista, a hidden waterfall cascading into a crystal-clear pool reflecting the sunlight. The constant rush of water echoed, creating a mesmerizing effect. Mr. Ernest stopped beside me, gazing at the falls with a faint smile. He seemed relaxed, more at ease than I'd ever seen him. "When I was younger, I'd come here to think," he said, his voice filled with a rare nostalgia. Before I could respond, he turned to me, his expression a mixture of simplicity and defiance. "Shall we?" he asked, his hands moving towards the button of his shorts. I froze. This wasn't the kind of invitation I'd expected. My eyes, almost involuntarily, fixed on his movements. He unbuttoned his shorts, letting them fall to his ankles, revealing a physique that appeared even more imposing in the natural light. The marks of time were there, subtle lines that complemented a solid, well-maintained musculature. Mr. Ernest then removed his shirt, pulling it over his head. I couldn't look away. The stern man I knew now seemed transformed, confident, imposing, and utterly comfortable displaying a body honed by years of discipline and physical activity. "What are you waiting for, Hugo?" he asked, looking directly at me, the question sounding more like an order. I swallowed, still speechless. This wasn't a dream. It was very real, and my mind struggled to comprehend why it was affecting me so strongly. With some hesitation, I began to remove my shirt, feeling Mr. Ernest's gaze on me. As I unbuttoned my shorts and let them fall, I paused, taking a deep breath before stepping into the water. He was still watching me, but his gaze was different, softer than usual. For the first time, it seemed the impenetrable armor he always wore. The authority, the vigilance, the distrust had fallen away. Gone was the judgment, replaced by something softer, something I couldn't quite define. I waded into the cool water and dove under, the chill enveloping me. When I resurfaced, he was a few meters away, wiping the water from his face with large, firm hands, his eyes never leaving me. "Finally decided to enjoy it, eh?" he commented, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. I simply nodded, feeling any verbal response would come out too shaky to be convincing. As we swam in silence, it was undeniable that something had shifted. Mr. Ernest was different, more relaxed, almost human. The sounds of the water mingled with the quiet of the surrounding forest. I tried to act naturally, but it was impossible to ignore what was happening. Mr. Ernest, just a few meters away, as relaxed as I'd ever seen him, had one hand submerged, clearly adjusting his swimwear, or, more specifically, his genitals. At first, I thought it might be an unconscious gesture, something he wasn't aware of. But as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that wasn't the case. He knew I was watching. There was no hurry in his movements, no attempt to conceal it. On the contrary, it felt like a test, as if he was waiting to see my reaction. We exited the water, and Mr. Ernest was starting to become aroused. I was at a loss, completely unsure how to react. I tried to mask my shyness, but my heart was pounding. After drying off and getting dressed, I still felt awkward, but I did my best to maintain a sense of normalcy. Mr. Ernest, however, seemed entirely at ease, adjusting his shorts and running a hand through his wet hair as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. "Let's go back another way. I want to show you a place," he said, gesturing toward a narrower path leading deeper into the woods. I nodded, trying to hide my curiosity, but his tone was suggestive. There was something in his invitation that hinted at more than just a scenic view, as if the destination held a deeper significance. The path was overgrown, low-hanging branches occasionally scratching my skin. The damp scent of the forest was strong, mixed with the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. The silence between us was broken only by his occasional words, recounting stories of his youth. He spoke of adventures with friends, days free of responsibility, moments that, according to him, shaped the man he was today. As we walked, I noticed a change in his voice. It wasn't the usual controlled, authoritative tone. It was lighter, as though being in this place transported him back to a time before the burdens of family and the tough guy persona. I was intrigued, each step fueling my curiosity about what he wanted to show me. He seemed so connected to this place, so at peace, that I was eager to understand its meaning for him. "We're almost there," he said, turning back momentarily with a rare smile. My anticipation grew, both from the hike and the unknown destination. After a few more minutes, the path began to widen, revealing a small wooden hut nestled in a clearing, partially obscured by trees and dense vegetation. It was rustic, almost primitive, with an old thatched roof and walls of thick planks, some covered with moss. "Here it is," Mr. Ernest said, stopping and gazing at the hut with a blend of nostalgia and satisfaction. The structure looked like something out of a film, the kind of makeshift shelter you'd expect to see in stories about hunters or survivalists. Despite its humble appearance, it possessed a unique charm, as if each piece of wood held a story. "Is it a hunter's cabin?" I asked, breaking the silence as I studied the hut. He smiled slightly, crossing his arms as he looked at the building. "That's what I thought the first time I saw it, but no. This was our hiding place, mine and my friends, back when life was simpler." His tone revealed the weight of his memories. It was clear this hut was more than just wood and thatch. It was a piece of who he was before the responsibilities and pressures of adulthood. We'd spend hours here, escaping from home, from the world. It was our refuge. His voice was softer than I was accustomed to, further piquing my interest. I watched as he approached the cabin, pushing open the creaking door. "Shall we go in?" he asked without looking back. I hesitated briefly, but my curiosity won out. I followed him inside, wondering what secrets this place held. Mr. Ernest seemed completely at home within the hut, as though returning to a familiar sanctuary. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated, as if testing my reaction to the surroundings, or perhaps to his presence. Suddenly, he turned to me, his expression calm, but his tone leaving little room for argument. "I'm going to hang my clothes to dry." "My underwear is wet," he said, his hands moving directly to the zipper of his shorts. I froze, watching as he calmly unzipped them. My gaze involuntarily followed his shorts as they pooled around his ankles. He stood there, fully exposed, and the impressive size of his penis was impossible to ignore. Embarrassment flooded me. My face burned, and I quickly averted my eyes, but not before the image was seared into my memory. He didn't seem to mind my reaction, or perhaps he'd anticipated it. "Put yours out to dry too," he suggested, his voice firm but unhurried as he gathered his clothes and stepped outside to hang them. I was frozen, unsure what to do. My mind raced, and the thought of undressing in front of him made my heart pound. For a few seconds, I remained motionless, debating whether to follow his suggestion. Finally, I decided to comply. With some hesitation, I removed my shorts and underwear, trying not to overthink it, and stepped out of the hut into the bright sunshine. We laid our clothes side by side to dry. I could still feel the heat rising in my face, not just from the sun, but from the awkwardness of the situation. He, on the other hand, seemed completely comfortable, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. After hanging our clothes, we returned to the hut. The silence inside was heavy, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves outside. I wandered over to one wall, where old markings were etched into the wood. They looked like drawings or notes left by someone long ago. As I examined them, a mixture of curiosity and a strange, undefined feeling stirred within me. I was so engrossed in the scribbles that I barely noticed him approach. His footsteps were firm but silent, and suddenly he was right behind me. The heat radiating from his body filled the space between us, creating a palpable tension. That's when I felt it. Without even looking, I knew he was aroused. His penis, previously an uncomfortable detail to ignore, was now erect, almost touching me. My heart raced. I didn't know where to look or what to do or say. "I realized you were watching me," he whispered, his voice low and husky, directly into my ear. His proximity left me speechless. His breath was warm against my skin, each word charged with an intent I couldn't ignore. "Is that what you want?" he added, his tone direct but unhurried, as if testing me once more. I remained motionless, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. My mind was in turmoil as his question hung in the silence of the cabin, waiting for an answer I didn't know I possessed. I was completely unresponsive, my body frozen, but my heart hammering in my chest. Before I could process what was happening, I felt his firm hand on my waist. The touch was warm, assertive, yet surprisingly gentle. He slowly turned me around, and when our eyes met, it was as if the world outside the hut ceased to exist. Without a word, he leaned in and kissed me. His lips were firm, the kiss intense. His beard brushed lightly against my skin, a novel and almost indescribable sensation. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, arousing a mixture of surprise and desire. As the kiss deepened, his hands began to explore my body. One moved up my back, while the other slowly trailed down my side, as if mapping every inch of me. The warmth of his touch elicited unexpected responses from my body, sending shivers down my spine. Then, without hesitation, he took my hand and guided it to him. When my fingers brushed against his erection, I realized just how aroused he was. Its hardness and size startled me, and my mind became even more confused, torn between hesitation and a burgeoning desire. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He was lost in the moment, and I felt myself being drawn in. Without further ado, he pushed me against the wall, firmly but not roughly. The impact caught me off guard, and my hands instinctively went up, bracing against the wood. The scribbles I had been examining were now inches from my face, close enough to see the deep grooves etched over time. The sound of my rapid breathing filled the quiet cabin. I could feel his energy behind me, his presence almost enveloping me. My hands remained pressed against the wall, as if that support were all that kept me grounded. The tension in the air was thick. As I stood there, hands against the wall, the scribbles in front of me, an unexpected sound broke the silence. The distinct sound of spitting, amplified in the confines of the cabin. Immediately afterward, I felt a pressure building, a new sensation that began subtly but intensified rapidly. My body reacted instantly, tensing and trembling, every fiber trying to comprehend and adjust to what was happening. The wood of the wall felt cold beneath my palms, a stark contrast to the growing heat consuming me. My senses were heightened, the sound of his heavy breathing behind me, the subtle creak of the wooden floor, and the insistent pressure demanding more and more. I tried to relax, but it was easier said than done. My entire body was rigid, and every attempt to take a deep, relieving breath seemed futile. As much as I was, in some way, enjoying the experience, and there was no denying that, it wasn't easy. The rough wood of the wall scraped against my skin. The wood of the wall, rough and cold beneath my hands, felt like an anchor, a point of stability amidst the whirlwind of sensations. My breathing was rapid and irregular, and I struggled to find a rhythm that would allow me to surrender. The pressure remained constant, and I could feel his heat so close, so intense, that it seemed to merge with my own body. It was a strange mix of discomfort and desire, as if each movement challenged me to push beyond my limits. Despite the difficulty, a part of me didn't want it to stop. After several attempts, we finally found a rhythm. My body, initially resistant to the unfamiliar, began to adjust, and the initial discomfort gave way to a sensation that was both novel and intense. My breathing, previously tense and uneven, grew calmer, falling into sync with the movements that now flowed more naturally. The wall in front of me, with its time-worn scribbles, seemed to be my only connection to reality, while the rest of the world dissolved. The warmth of his body against mine was inescapable, a firm and dominant presence that seemed to command every part of me. Every touch, every movement, every sound amplified the experience, making it all the more immersive. Finally, we were in sync, and despite the initial awkwardness, I knew this was an experience I wouldn't soon forget. The pressure continued, but the resistance was gone. What had been discomfort had transformed into something unexpectedly pleasurable. The sensation was new, intense, and in a way I could never have imagined, incredibly satisfying. His movements accelerated, becoming firmer and more decisive. Each thrust sent a wave of heat through my body, as if we were connected in a singular, powerful way. My breathing grew heavier, panting against the wall, the scribbles in front of me becoming a focal point, a way to anchor myself amidst the swirling sensations. The sounds of our bodies echoed in the small space of the cabin, mingling with our gasps and the creaks of the wooden floor beneath us. The increasing intensity made me lose all track of time and place, leaving me completely surrendered to the moment. It was new, it was different, but above all, it was incredibly pleasurable. Each thrust felt faster and more intense. I could hear his panting breaths, hot against my ear, mingling with my own, while the cabin seemed to vibrate with the rhythm we had established. His hands gripped my waist tighter, the pressure increasing as the tension between us reached its peak. Suddenly he pulled me hard against him, our bodies flush against each other in a movement that intensified everything. It was in that moment that I felt his release inside me, an almost indescribable sensation, as if all the energy he'd built up had been poured into me. A few seconds later, my own body responded. A shiver ran down my spine, my muscles contracted, and I climaxed, my body trembling as waves of pleasure washed over me. For a few moments, We remained there, panting, still caught in the afterglow of the intense energy that filled the cabin. My mind was blank. My body surrendered to the exhaustion and relief that only such an experience could bring. We stood there for several minutes, catching our breath. The silence was broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. When our eyes finally met, the confusion hanging between us was palpable. Neither of us seemed to know what to say. There were no words for what had just happened, and perhaps none were needed. Without exchanging more than a glance, we began to dress, each movement slow and almost mechanical, as if we were both still processing the experience, while our hands automatically went through the motions of adjusting our clothes. The walk back along the trail was quieter than before. The sound of our footsteps on the dry earth seemed to echo between the trees, and the gentle breeze rustling the leaves felt oblivious to the inner turmoil I was experiencing. I avoided looking directly at him, but I could feel his firm presence beside me, so close yet charged with unspoken tension. When we reached the house, the aroma of home-cooked food enveloped us. The table was set with steaming plates of rice, beans, meat, and salad. Olivia and her mother were in high spirits, chatting about something that seemed miles removed from my current reality. "At last! I thought you'd gotten lost on the trail," Olivia said with a soft laugh. I forced a smile, trying to act normal, as I pulled up a chair and sat down at the table. We exchanged smiles, trying to appear relaxed, and Mr. Ernest was the first to speak. "It was so nice outside that we ended up extending our walk," he said, his voice firm but relaxed, as if nothing unusual had occurred. I simply nodded, playing along. Olivia, with a curious smile, watched us as she served the food. "My dad took you to the cabin, didn't he?" she asked, with that light, knowing tone that only she possessed. I tried to remain composed, even though my heart skipped a beat. I forced a smile, glancing briefly at Mr. Ernest before replying, "Yes, he showed me around." She laughed softly, nodding as she sat down beside me. "I figured as much. He loves that place. I've heard so many stories about his youth in that cabin that I can practically picture everything you saw." My smile remained fixed, but my mind was still reeling, stuck on what had transpired there. As she spoke, Mr. Ernest sat at the head of the table, adjusting his napkin with the same composure he'd displayed throughout lunch. It was remarkable how completely in control he seemed, even in such a clandestine situation. Lunch continued in a light-hearted mood, though for me, the tension lingered. Olivia and her mother chatted animatedly about everyday things, while I did my best to stay present in the conversation, but my mind kept drifting back to the cabin. Mr. Ernest, as always, seemed calm, presiding over the brief silences with an almost imposing presence. After we finished eating, he casually suggested, "How about some fishing? There's a river nearby that's perfect for it." Olivia looked at him in surprise. "Fishing, really, Dad? I think I'll pass this time. Besides, I need to help Mom with a few things around here." The way he responded, with a simple, "as you wish," made it clear that the invitation to Olivia was merely a formality. He didn't seem the least bit disappointed by her refusal. On the contrary, I could tell from his tone and the quick glance he threw my way that he'd extended the invitation expecting, perhaps even hoping, she would decline. Olivia didn't notice anything. She just smiled and turned her attention back to the table. I, however, wasn't sure whether to be more intrigued or apprehensive. "So, Hugo, are you in?" he asked, his eyes fixed on mine, almost like a veiled challenge. I smiled, trying to appear relaxed, and replied confidently, "Absolutely." Mr. Ernest stared at me for a brief moment before giving me that peculiar smile, discreet, but full of meaning. It was the kind of smile that spoke volumes, and it made my stomach churn slightly. "I'll get the gear," he said, rising from the table with his usual calmness, as if this were just another ordinary outing. As he walked toward the small storage room at the back of the house, I felt Olivia's curious gaze. "My dad really loves fishing," she commented with a light laugh as she began clearing the dishes. I just nodded, still sensing the remnants of that unspoken tension in the air. Try as I might, I couldn't ignore the exchange of glances between Mr. Ernest and me, and what it signified for both of us, while for her, it was just another normal day. He returned carrying a small tackle box, the smile still firmly planted on his face, as if it were a silent reminder of what had transpired earlier, and what was perhaps yet to come. He stopped beside me, making a point of looking directly into my eyes, and it was impossible not to feel the weight of that gaze. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and steady. For a moment, my mind wavered. It was a simple question, but the way he delivered it carried a different meaning, something that went beyond simply being ready to fish. There was a hidden meaning, a veiled provocation that made my heart race. I knew I had an opportunity to back down, but instead, I held his gaze and answered firmly, even though I felt a knot in my stomach. "Yes, I am." Mr. Ernest held my gaze for a few more seconds, as if confirming my answer, before letting out an almost imperceptible smile. He nodded slightly, then turned toward the door, as if there were nothing extraordinary about our exchange. "Then let's go," he said, walking toward the path leading to the river. We reached the river after a short walk. The sound of running water filled the air, mingling with birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was a peaceful setting, but inside, I was far from at ease. As we prepared the fishing lines and cast them into the water, my mind began to wander. I thought about everything that had happened in the cabin, how unexpected and inappropriate it had been. Olivia didn't deserve this, and the weight of that thought made me uneasy. Try as I might to concentrate on fishing, my eyes remained fixed on the water, unseeing, while my head swirled with doubts. It was then that Mr. Ernest noticed my distraction. He looked at me, his expression curious but still bearing that familiar air of control. "Is everything all right?" he asked, breaking the silence with his deep voice. My mind snapped back to the present. I didn't want him to perceive my inner conflict, so I forced a smile and replied, "Yes, everything's fine." He nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. After a moment of silence, he set down his fishing rod and looked at me again, this time with a more direct tone. "Hugo, I wanted to tell you that I enjoyed what happened earlier." His words caught me off guard. My heart pounded, and I felt my face flush. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I kept my gaze fixed on the water, trying to process what he'd just said. I wrestled with his honesty, my hands sweating as I gripped the fishing rod. I couldn't help but give an honest answer, despite the turmoil churning inside me. "I enjoyed it too, but it's wrong what we did," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He was silent for a few moments, watching the fishing line bob in the water as if carefully considering his next words. Finally, he looked up at me and said firmly, "I know, and we're not going to do it again." There was a gravity in his voice, a finality that made me believe him. Even so, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief, mingled with regret. It was as if he'd put an end to something that was both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. He returned to his fishing as if that brief moment of confession had been just another part of the conversation. I, however, remained lost in thought, trying to process everything that had happened and, more importantly, how to move forward. The fishing trip ended peacefully. We'd caught a few decent-sized fish, and Mr. Ernest, in his reserved manner, seemed satisfied with the results. We walked back to the house in silence, the sound of our footsteps echoing along the trail as the sky turned orange with the setting sun. Back at the house, everything seemed normal. Olivia and her mother were in the living room, chatting cheerfully about recipes and other everyday matters. The mood was light, almost as if the day's events were just another fleeting memory. But for me, it wasn't so simple. Evening arrived, and dinner was served. We all sat together at the table, the clinking of cutlery against plates mingling with Olivia's laughter as she recounted stories of our time together. Mr. Ernest was calm, participating in the conversation as naturally as ever, as if nothing were amiss. After dinner, everyone retired for the night. The house fell silent, the stillness broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves outside. I lay down next to Olivia, but sleep wouldn't come. The images of everything that had happened that day replayed in my mind. Every detail was etched into my memory, the looks, the touches, the words, spoken and unspoken. The more I tried to push these thoughts away, the more insistent they became, making it impossible to relax. I tossed and turned, searching for a comfortable position, but the restlessness within me was too strong. What had happened with Mr. Ernest was something I could never have foreseen, and now it felt impossible to ignore. Unable to lie still any longer, I got out of bed. The weight of my thoughts still pressed down on me, and all I wanted was to clear my head. I walked quietly to the kitchen, trying not to wake anyone. The house was dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. When I opened the refrigerator, the hum of the motor and the glow of the light inside broke the stillness. I grabbed a bottle of water and was about to pour myself a glass when I heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. My heart jumped, and I turned quickly. It was Mr. Ernest. He was wearing only underwear, the silvery moonlight outlining his still robust and imposing physique. He seemed completely at ease, as if wandering around the house like this was perfectly natural. He approached slowly, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. When he drew closer, he looked directly into my eyes and asked in a low voice, "Can't sleep either?" "No, I've been thinking about what happened," I replied, my voice low and hesitant. He didn't respond immediately, but his eyes remained fixed on mine, as if weighing every word I'd spoken. Then, without haste, he stepped closer, until there was barely any space between us. His large, warm hand rested gently on my shoulder, the touch firm, yet comforting. "Stay calm. It's okay," he said, his voice deep and quiet, charged with an intensity that seemed to fill the room. Before I could react, he pulled me into an embrace. His body, warm and solid, pressed against mine, and the contact was impossible to ignore. It was then that I felt his penis, already beginning to stir, against me. "Touch me," he whispered. The heat that surged through my body was immediate. I couldn't deny my own reaction. His closeness, combined with everything that had already transpired, meant that I was also becoming aroused. The air crackled with an unspoken tension. There were no words between us, just the sensation of our bodies responding to each other in that embrace, which was quickly becoming more than just comforting. I pulled away from him, my heart pounding, and took a few steps back. Without a word, I returned to the bedroom. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts that seemed impossible to untangle. Now, I sit here alone, the dim moonlight streaming through the window, my head still spinning. I'm torn between two worlds, the love and commitment I have for Olivia, the woman I've chosen to share my life with, and this unexpected, intense, and unsettling attraction to Mr. Ernest. I have to make a decision. I can't continue like this, consumed by these two conflicting desires. As soon as I've decided what to do, I'll come back and tell you how things turned out. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with anyone you think might enjoy it. See you later.